we are often gifted in certain areas, and those areas we tend to excel. The work that we do in those areas is easy, and the input to output ratio is usually pretty good. And whenever we start to work on things that don't come nearly as easily or nearly as naturally, it's easy to be discouraged and to kind of shift from those things that are harder to things that are easier, because they are easier. We like taking the easy route out in a lot of things. And in Christianity, it's the same way. We will find things that seem to kind of come naturally in areas that we excel in, and we make really good headway very quickly. You will find things that are simply simple and simply pleasurable to do things when it comes to Christianity. And there are other things that are a lot harder, areas that we don't enjoy, things that come a little bit tougher on us. And we tend to kind of shy away from those things in order to find things that are easier. We leave those tasks for other individuals who are best suited for that work, always leaving it to somebody else to do that job. We want to look at a few of the mindsets that kind of go along with that and the reasons that God has given us hard things to do. If you're there in Deuteronomy chapter 30, the first thing is simply to say that we as Christians are called to do difficult things. But it's also important to know the things that you find difficult, others may find fairly easy. The areas that you maybe are not quite as blessed in are areas that other people might find themselves to be rather blessed in. We shouldn't be automatically discouraged, nor should we say, well, that's someone else's job to do those things because they are hard, simply to state that we are gifted in different areas. We shouldn't be discouraged in ourselves, nor should we prejudge others for their lack of effort, or their lack of success, rather, in areas that we find to be natural and easy. Maybe it's forgiveness that you struggle with. Maybe it's forgiving others who have harmed you or harmed others that you love and you care about. Perhaps it's maybe a struggle of faithfulness or attendance. Our lives get crowded with a lot of things, and time management's not always in our wheelhouse. And so finding time to be faithful in attendance to God is not always something that people find easy. And maybe it's lust or greed or jealousy that you just really have a struggle with. But whatever the case is, whatever the problem is, saying that it's just simply too hard has never been a valid excuse. Saying that it's just hard doesn't really cut mustard, if that's really the right phrase for it. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 30, there in verse 11 and verse 14, Moses, as he's kind of ending his long spiels or long recounts of the Old Testament law, he reminds them in verse 11 that this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you. Neither is it far off. But the word is very near you in verse 14. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can do it. I don't know how many times in either myself and my own excuses, I just tell myself it's hard. And that somehow for me becomes a blank slate of, okay, cool. We'll try something that's a little bit easier, because it's hard is good enough sometimes for me to quit. And encouraging other people, I hear the same thing from them as well. It's hard, it's difficult. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I don't know how it's going to ever succeed. I can't overcome this obstacle because it's hard. And in saying it's hard, we alleviate ourselves from responsibility. And as Moses is ending here, Deuteronomy, he tells the people that this is going to be one of their excuses. One of the things that they fall back on and say, well, it's hard. You know? It's hard, oh well, big deal. And it reminds them there in verse 11, this commandment that I give you today is not too hard for you. And there in verse 14, it is in your heart and in your mouth, and you can do it. Now, keeping that in mind, turn over to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. Now we know that the Old Testament is sometimes described as being cumbersome, or being weighty, or being things that are just a burden on the people. Because there was a lot of rules, a lot of regulations, a lot of ceremony that they had to go through. And in comparison to that, Jesus tells us here in Matthew chapter 11, there in verse 28, he says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, if Moses, for a law that is admittedly a more stringent, more critical, pointed, detailed-oriented law, if he says that this law is not too hard for you, that you're able to do it, and then Jesus tells us here in Matthew chapter 11, there in verse 28 and verse 30, that his law, in comparison, is easy and his burden is light, that those who are heavy laden and labored, that he will give them rest. That is not to say that Christianity cannot be difficult in times, but it's to remember that in being difficult is an excuse not to do what we ought to do. And realizing that what we have today, the law that we are to keep, the law of Christ, is still a more light law. One that should be more pleasurable and a lot more yielding for its return than the law of Moses. And in comparison, it should be quite a bit easier. If you turn with me to 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5. We'll look there in verse 3. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3, John writes, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome to us." Now, what he's saying there in verse 3 is not that if you find God's laws to be burdensome at times, that you aren't doing your job properly. What he's saying there is that as you continue to practice righteousness, as you continue to practice the skills that come along with being a godly individual, those things become easier. And in becoming easier, they become more enjoyable. It is a progression that he's speaking of here in verse 3, not an absolute mentality of, well, these are always joyful things. Paul writes, whenever he writes to the Corinthians, in tears and in anguish. He tells of the Thessalonians there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 that he has grieved over them in the state that they have come to. Doesn't mean that he's abandoning the principles here in 1 John chapter 5. But the idea being the more that you work on something, anything in life, the easier it becomes. And the easier it becomes, the more enjoyment you get out of it. And the same comes with Christianity. We delude ourselves sometimes of believing that we are going to grow in the areas that we're going to grow in by simply having things easy for us. And that's not the case. The second point I'd like to make when it comes to doing things that are difficult and hard is that love demands a sacrifice. Anything that we love demands some type of a sacrifice. If you're an animal person, it's sometimes the small things or the big things. If you're an animal person, you got to buy pet food, you got to get vaccinations, you got to take the dog or cat, I guess if you want to walk your cat, you got to take it for a walk. Sometimes you have to skip certain events because you got to run home and get your animal taken care of, and then you got to come back to do whatever you want to do. There's all kinds of things that go along with simply owning an animal, and yet oftentimes, if you're an animal person, you pay that price and you pay it joyfully because you love your animal. When it comes to children, there are bigger and bigger sacrifices that we as parents make all the time for our children. And hopefully, at the end of the day, as we lay our head down to rest, we think, okay, it was worth it. Still love my kids at the end of the day. Sometimes we have to wait till the next morning, but hopefully we come back to that same mentality of I love my children and it was worth it. For those who simply have, not simply have friends, but for those who friends is a big part of their life. How many times have you gone to places or participated in events that your friends wanted to do because they wanted to do them, but you really had no interest in them? Probably quite a bit, because you love your friends. How many times have you covered someone when they go, well, we'd like to go to the movies, but I'm all out of cash. Oh, don't worry about it, I got you covered. We do those things because we love them, because love demands a sacrifice. And if you're there in 1 John, go back one chapter into chapter 4. John tells us that we know that God loves us because of the sacrifices that he has given to us. There in 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 9, John writes, "In this the love of God was made known or made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he has loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for sin." The idea that we know that God loves because of this sacrifice is what John uses to ramp to the point here in chapter 4, that if we love God, we have to make sacrifices for him. If we claim to love God, we ought to make sacrifices for the brethren around us. The same is true for all areas of Christianity. If we truly claim to love, either to love God or love our brethren, or hopefully both, that love is going to demand a sacrifice. Our discipleship is not free. It's going to cost us something. And our love for God is not shown in the things that come naturally and easy and things that we already want to do. Our love is exemplified by the things that are hard and difficult and we spend our time and energy on diligently trying. In 2 Samuel chapter 24 is a really, really neat passage. 2 Samuel chapter 24, they have located the Ark of the Covenant. They have tried to move it. For some reason, they never went back and just read how to move it. So they put it on a new cart. Oxen stumble. Man puts out his hand and dies for touching the ark. And so they park the ark there inside of a silo. And whenever David comes back after reading how to move it, they pick it up and they move it a few feet. And everyone just stops and praises God. And the owner of the silo offers David, take it. Take the silo, take the animals that tread in it, have it all as a sacrifice to God. Praise God with it. And then here in verse 24, the king said to the owner, no, I will not buy it from, no, but I will buy it from you for a price. For I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that has cost me nothing. So David brought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. Now there's the idea that if I love God, there's going to be a sacrifice involved. I can't just take something that you've given me and then just give it right back to God because it doesn't cost me anything. All I am is the middleman. So David says, I'll pay for it, and then it'll cost me something in order to make this sacrifice. Our love for God is shown and exemplified in the effort that we put in to be good and satisfying servants of Him. Things being hard in our Christian walk is not an excuse to get us out of our service to God, but it should be the very thing that shows that we truly love God. So our excuse of it's hard shouldn't get us out of things. What it should say is hard. I'm going to show how much I love God in the effort that I put in for this, whatever it is you have to currently do. If you move back over to James chapter 1, there is a simple fact about our physicality that if you want to become physically stronger, you have to work through resistance. You lift weights in order to gain more muscle mass. You run further than is naturally comfortable in order to gain more endurance. No one has ever become a world-class athlete by simply sitting on the couch and eating potato chips. That's the easiest thing in the world, to sit on the couch, eat potato chips, enjoy a good TV show. But nobody becomes an athlete by doing that. It is years of practice doing the things that maybe they love or sometimes that they come to hate because of how much they have to do it. But they work through those things in order to become better at it. All the effort, all the hours of practice, all the sacrifices that are made, they do it in order to become as strong as possible in the area that they're trying to excel. But when it comes to our spirituality, we delude ourselves in believing that we grow stronger in nothing. That if I just simply sit back and think about my relationship with God, if I just feel in my heart that God and I have a good relationship, I'll grow in my spirituality. James writes here in James chapter 1, starting there in verse 2. This very well may be the very first book of the New Testament that was written, kind of chronologically speaking. We're writing to a group of individuals who have left their home, left their jobs, left their country in order to escape persecution as Christians. And he tells them in verse 2, the very first thing he writes to them about what they need to know about the hardships that they're going through. He says, count it all joy, my brethren, when you meet trials of various kinds. Now, he isn't trying to minimize the hardship that they're going through. He's not trying to minimize that it's hard for them to go through these things. What he says is that you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. He's putting forward the idea that we are strengthened in our spirituality through the resistance that we find. If we were to metaphorically sit back on our spiritual couch and eat spiritual potato chips, strength does not happen. We are strengthened when we struggle and we grow in those areas that we're currently working through. We grow when we face obstacles. We grow in our faith when we think, I don't know how God's going to ever bring me through this situation, and then God brings us through that situation. We don't grow in contentment by just simply having all that we want. We grow in contentment by the times that we lose the things we think we need. We don't grow in love whenever we just love those who love us. We grow in love in areas that we have to love someone who is adamantly opposed to us and all that we stand for. If we consider all the great men and women of faith through the Bible, they always have smaller and incremental challenges before the main event that kind of makes them famous in our minds. Abraham didn't become Abraham who offered Isaac back when he was 75. He didn't do that until he was like 100 and something. It took him a long time to grow to be that individual. Sometimes if we view our challenges as smaller obstacles and smaller roadblocks to grow us into the individual that we need to be, that might be a better perspective of the things that we're currently going through. Turn with me to Philippians chapter 1. We'll go kind of peruse through the book of Philippians in a quick fashion. There is an interesting relationship between hard work and satisfaction and resolve. Things that kind of come easily or things that kind of are given to you naturally do bring some amount of joy and satisfaction, but whenever you work for it, usually it's a lot more. We kind of maybe teach this to our kids at a really young age. If you're just given a bicycle, I remember going through the neighborhood, and I don't know if bicycles are probably as important as they were when I was a kid. But my dad would drive down the road and he would point out what kids who had their bicycles just kind of laid over in the gravel. He goes, I bet their parents just gave them that bicycles. And his idea was that if you were just given a bicycle, you don't really care what happens because you didn't work for it. But if you mowed the lawn or you raked the grass and you earned your allowance and you paid for your bicycle, you're going to care for it a little bit more than if you didn't. The same thing kind of goes for the girl who gets her summer job in order to pay for her first car, or at least pay half or whatever the arrangement is with the parents. Usually they get a little bit more enjoyment from their vehicle if they kind of contribute to it. And the same thing goes when it comes to our spirituality. If we work hard for our faith, if we're challenged in those things, and we make it our own, we usually get a lot more satisfaction. And it becomes ours. We have a lot more resolve for the things that we have worked diligently for. We'll find more satisfaction in the sacrifices, in the acts of love that we have done for others if it cost us more. It sounds counterintuitive, but it really is the case. If we consider Paul here in Philippians, Paul, by all means, worked extremely hard for his faith. In fact, in chapter 3, he spends verses kind of 1 through 11 dealing with all the things he had to leave behind, all the things he kind of gave up to be a Christian. And after all the hardships and the persecutions, after the shipwrecks and the beatings, after currently being in prison while writing this book and waiting to find out whether he's going to die, he writes probably one of the happiest books in the New Testament. And what I mean by that is in chapter 1, he talks about joy. In chapter 2, he talks about joy. In chapter 3, he talks about joy. In chapter 4, he talks about joy. And so just kind of perusing a couple of verses here in verse 18 of chapter 1, he says that, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. Now, if you kind of continue on into chapter 2, verses 17 and verse 18, Paul writes there in chapter 2, even if I am poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad, and I rejoice with you all. Likewise, you should be glad and rejoice with me. Chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same thing to you is no trouble to me, and it is safe for you. And probably the most infamous verse, infamous is not the right, the most famous verse in chapter 4 and verse 4, he says, finally, my brother, rejoice in the Lord, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say, rejoice. But he doesn't end there. Over in chapter 4 and verse 10, he writes again, I rejoice in the Lord greatly, that now at length you have received your concerns about me. You are indeed concerned, but you have no opportunity. Philippians, you can't get past the fact that Paul is rejoicing in all the things that he is currently going through, even though it's hard. The more that Paul works for the things, his faith, the more that he works for his brother, and the more sacrifices he makes, it seems that his letters are happier to some degree as he goes on. There's that converse relationship that the more that you have to work for something, the more joy you get back out of it. Sometimes we rob ourselves of that joy by simply saying, well, it's hard. I'll find something that's easier to do. Over in Romans chapter 8, we'll look at 3 more passages. Over in Romans chapter 8. The last point I would like to make is simply it's worth it. All the work, all the toil, all the sweat, tears, the sacrifice, the trials, all that we go through true to be a Christian, it's worth it. When you have a little voice in your ears trying to tell you or convince you that it's not worth it, it is. When friends or family have turned their backs on you and told you you need to give up and quit, don't. If you're ever tempted to give up and just take the easy way out, keep on pressing on. Here in Romans chapter 8, there in verse 18, Paul writes, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present times are not even worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us." A couple pages over in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul has a very similar sentiment. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and in verse 18, he says, "For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory that is beyond all comparison, as we look not only to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." In both of these, we see that the things that now seem huge and insurmountable, the weights that seem to weigh us down and feel like they're going to just rip us apart, he says that in comparison to everything else, they're small. The trials that seem to stretch out in eternity, he says, compared to actual eternity, they're kind of short. For the hardships that we endure now, compared to the glory of being in God's presence, he says it's not even worth comparing. What Paul is encouraging his readers in both the book of Romans and 2 Corinthians is to keep on pressing on. When things get hard, don't give up. And you know what's not worth it? Giving up. Paul uses the analogy of our Christian walk as being a race. And almost the imagery that's set out before us is that you're running this race in the Olympics. You know, the biggest competition in the world. You have this long race to run, and you're a full lap ahead of everybody else. And you're nearing the home stretch, coming right at the cross line, the finish line, and then you just say, it's just so hard. I'm just going to lay down here on the track and take a nap. It's too much to finish the last 50 yards and to win the race. I'm just going to quit now. And the reason I say that is because he has given us everything to weight the race in our balance. He has saved us. He has given us his Son to save us when we couldn't save ourselves. He has given us his Holy Spirit as a guarantee of our inheritance. Here in Romans chapter 8, where we were just looking, he mentions that the Holy Spirit intercedes for us in our prayers. And we have a whole group of Christians that we get to meet with on a regular basis who are willing to bear our burdens and encourage us, to help us whenever we are weak. He has set it up so that if you want to succeed, you will succeed. He has removed all of the obstacles, or he has given you means by which to remove all obstacles if you so choose. And yet, oftentimes we lose that perspective and we simply just give up too quickly. We're right near the finish line and we say, it's just too hard to finish the race. And we give up. We get sidetracked and we get distracted by all the other flashy, shiny things that happen in our lives. And we forget to see that all that we see and touch and feel and experience here in this life is but a shadow of the true life to come. Abraham did what seemed to be impossible time and time again. If you turn over to Hebrews chapter 11, there in verse 8, 9, and 10, the question comes up, how did Abraham, being an older gentleman, do so much with his life in the later years? How could you commit to leaving a city that was well-founded, that had schools, and maybe even possibly running water through the houses, like an aqueduct system, to go live in a tent in a land that you have never seen? How are you going to convince your wife to go and do that? And then go through all the things that he went through. He did it by keeping his perspective focused on heaven. He didn't keep on looking back to the city that he left behind, but he kept on looking forward to the city that laid ahead. And that's what the Hebrew writer makes the point here in chapter 11, verse 8. He says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. And there in verse 10, for he was looking forward to a city that had foundations, whose designer and builder was God. Whenever we find things that are hard in our lives, tasks that seem challenging, remember that we grow through the things that are challenging. That by challenging ourselves that we actually will increase our joy and our satisfaction in our service. In those things we see that we prove not just that we like being a Christian, but we truly love God's people and we love God through the sacrifices that we make. And never give up. Keep your eyes on the prize. The people I know up in Pennsylvania had kind of made the little catchphrase to love God, to serve others, and to do hard things. And in that's my simple challenge for this week, is to love God, to serve others, and to do hard things. Not to let hard things be an excuse to give up and to let someone else take charge of that, but to dig into the challenge and to do the best that we can with the things that we have been given. Jeff has picked up the song number 505. Almost changed the song name, Jim. The beginning of our Christian walk begins with a very hard thing, and that's humility. To give ourselves over to God wholly and completely and let Him to be the guidance force of our life. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that we no longer live for ourselves, and that's a huge task. It's a lot we give up. But all that we give up, we gain back tenfold, hundredfold. All the things that we think are important in life, we get all the things that are really important in life. And then when we stray off the path, we become prideful, self-centered individuals who live for ourselves, and we have to come back to that same humility and throw ourselves in God's mercy. If we can help you to do that hard thing this morning, either coming to God for the first time or giving your life back over to Him, let us know as we stand and sing number 505.